305 lecture on semantics of words. This is in preparation for the problem set that is due Monday, March 31st, when we get back from spring break. So you're probably on your spring break right now, in fact, and I hope you're enjoying it. I'm actually in San Francisco. I'm in the process of moving to San Francisco, and so I'm sitting here in a nice little park in the Levi Strauss Plaza, and so if you hear some traffic noises and things in the background, that is why. So let's see, why don't we go back to this picture that we looked at last week when we looked at the lexicon. And back then I referred to this idea that what language is at its core is a relationship between sound and meaning. This is actually not my idea. This is the idea of Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist who's kind of the father of modern linguistics. So we had this kind of picture where language is at the interface between this world of sound and the world of meaning. And I illustrated the world of meaning with a little thought bubble down there at the bottom. And we've covered all these areas of theoretical linguistics now: phonology, morphology, syntax, and all that's left is semantics. So we're going to look at how this interface between language and thought, or language and concepts. I had a lecture called Language and Thought, and I decided to just cancel that. It's not really essential to core linguistics, so we're just going to plunge ahead into semantics of words today. And this is kind of an interesting topic because it gets us out of linguistics to some extent, and it gets us into some related areas, in particular philosophy and psychology. So this is this area of semantics, which is the study of meaning, is really associated with those two fields just as much as linguistics. So let's start with the philosophy. Let's look at some philosophical issues having to do with word meaning. Like, for example, what is word meaning really at the basic abstract level? How do we get this mapping that Saussure talked about between this vague amorphous world of sound and the equally vague and amorphous world of meaning? How does this mapping come about? And in particular, how do certain sets of phonemes that make up words come to be associated with particular concepts? How does the word tree, that sound tree, how does that come to be associated with trees? And philosophers have different ideas about this. Here I put up a quote from Humpty Dumpty. This is from Lewis Carroll's Through the Looking Glass, and Humpty Dumpty says, "When I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." So that's the idea that he can just have any association between sound and meaning that he chooses. We might call that an idiosyncratic theory of meaning. But that's just a non-starter. That would never work, because then everyone would have their own separate mapping from sound to meaning. And that's not how language works. Language works by social convention. Everyone has to agree that tree means tree, and dog means dog, and Google means Google, and so on. That's the only way that language could work socially. So we can't have our own private kinds of meanings. So the idiosyncratic approach we can rule out right away, but there are two other approaches that were discussed by Plato. This is the oldest recorded linguistic discussion in at least the European tradition. This is a dialogue, a Platonic dialogue called the Cratylus. It was written down in 400 BC, and it's a debate, as these dialogues always are, between Hermogenes and Cratylus, and about this very question: how do words acquire their meaning? And in this discussion, you can find it online and read it yourself if you want, but Hermogenes takes what's called the conventionalist position, which is sort of what I just said, that society as a whole decides on this relationship. We all agree that dog means dog and cat means cat. So that's an approach that we could say is conventionalist, and it posits an arbitrary relationship between sound and meaning. So, it's arbitrary in the sense that it could have gone either way. We could have decided that cat means dog and dog means cat. We could have switched around the sounds. There's nothing in this view that's particularly dog-like about the word dog, and so on. And that, I think, is the most sensible position to take regarding language. And this was also the position of Saussure. Because if you think about it, if this weren't the case, then all the languages of the world would be the same. If dog naturally meant dog, then all the languages, Swahili and Japanese and Greek and French, they would all have a word that sounds like dog. And the alternative position is called the naturalist position, and this was advocated by Cratylus in this dialogue. And he said, no, there's actually a natural meaning between words and concepts. So in other words, certain words are better than others. Certain words for dog are more dog-like than other words. And so there's this kind of ideal word for dog and an ideal word for horse. And that's not a surprise that a Greek philosopher would advocate a position like that. Remember, the ancient Greeks, the Platonists believed in essentialism, that there's some essential horseness to a horse and essential dogness to a dog, and so on. But these days, that position seems pretty untenable, right? Because, like I said, if there was a natural word for dog, then every language would use that word. But of course, they're all different. Spanish uses perro, and Japanese uses inu, and French uses chien, and German uses Hund, and in English we use dog, and so on. And they don't seem to be related. So that fact about the world's languages seems to support the conventionalist position that there's basically just an arbitrary relationship between sound and meaning that constitutes words. Arbitrary, that is, but still consistent with the phonotactics of the language, the syllable structure and phonological structure and so on. Alright, so now that we've examined that issue about the basic philosophical relation between sound and meaning, we can look at some other ideas about meaning that come from the philosophical tradition. And in particular, we can distinguish two kinds of meaning. This is a distinction they make in chapter 7 between reference and other types of meaning. So let's look at reference first. Reference is a kind of meaning where a word refers directly to some object in the real world. You could imagine take a proper name like Barack Obama, right? And then imagine what Barack Obama means. It really refers to the person, the guy who's sitting there in the White House. You could imagine sort of a piece of fishing line or something attached to the word on one hand and then to the guy Barack Obama on the other hand, and that's sort of what reference is like. It's a direct connection between a word and some entity in the world. And that's a really good theory of meaning, at least for proper names like Barack Obama, Microsoft, San Francisco, and so on. These proper names really refer directly to objects in the world. And that kind of meaning is called reference. But meaning can't be that simple because, we have words that don't seem to refer to objects in the world. Especially, things like verbs and adjectives and things like that. They don't refer to entities in the way that Barack Obama does. Even common nouns like chair, you could have a reference theory that says that the word chair refers to the set of all chairs in the world or something like that. But it's probably better to just say that, there are other kinds of meaning besides reference. And that gets us into the second approach, conceptualism, and that says, in addition to just words referring to entities in the world, we have this idea of concepts, which are not directly entities in the world, but refer to abstractions in the mind. These are things in the mind. So maybe the chair, from a conceptualist point of view, refers to the concept, the general concept of a chair. And this seems more plausible for some types of words like alive and near, that are very kind of complex in their meaning, and they seem to denote concepts rather than entities in the world. So we need both of these kinds of meaning. Let me tell you a little bit about Frege. There's a philosopher named Gottlob Frege who considered this kind of issue, and he posed a paradox that explains why we can't get by with just a theory of reference where words refer to entities in the world. And he cited this example about the ancient Greeks. So the ancient Greeks had names for these entities up in the sky, and one they called Hesperus. This was the evening star, and when you walked out after dinner you would see Hesperus up in the sky, a very bright star that was the first star to appear in the evening. And then they would go to bed, and they would wake up in the morning, and they'd go outside at dawn, and they would see Phosphorus. Phosphorus was a very bright morning star. They called it the morning star, and it was in a different area of the sky. So for a long time, the ancient Greeks believed that Hesperus and Phosphorus were different stars, until the great mathematician Pythagoras, he figured out that actually they are the same star. And in fact, they're the planet Venus, what we today know of as the planet Venus. And so, of course, it's moving, and that's why it's in two different positions. And so anyway, look at sentence 1 here. This is what Pythagoras discovered. Hesperus is Phosphorus. And what Frege noticed is that, this was a great discovery, but if our theory of meaning is just a theory of reference, where Hesperus just refers to the actual entity in the sky and Phosphorus the same, then sentence 1 would be equivalent to sentence 2, Hesperus is Hesperus. Because, again, if the theory is just reference, then you can just substitute the entity for the word. This under the theory of reference, in other words, 1 and 2 have exactly the same informational content. And Frege pointed out that that's kind of a ridiculous result. I mean, sentence 1 is a great discovery, and sentence 2 is just a tautology, and it has no informational value whatsoever. So that led Frege to propose that we need two kinds of meaning. In other words, reference is not enough because it leads to these kinds of paradoxes, and so he proposed two kinds of meaning, reference and sense. And you can read in chapter 7, they have a nice discussion about sense and reference and the difference between them. But essentially, as I mentioned, reference is the relationship between words and entities in the world, and sense is more about concepts. It's about our mental images of words and so on. You might think of senses as kind of like dictionary descriptions. So the sense of a chair is something like, something you sit on that has 4 legs or 3 legs and a back to support you. And the sense of the word aunt is the sister of one of your parents, and so on. It's sort of like dictionary definitions. And that's a second kind of meaning. So reference is a direct relationship between a proper name and some entity in the world, and then sense is a more abstract kind of meaning that has to do with mental notions or concepts of words. And so Frege's point was, once you have this kind of distinction, you can make sense out of these paradoxes like Hesperus is Phosphorus. You could say something like, even though Hesperus and Phosphorus have different senses, one has the sense of being the evening star and the other is the morning star, they happen to have the same reference. Or if you don't like that Hesperus Phosphorus stuff, think of more contemporary examples. Think of, say, Clark Kent is Superman. That's really an equivalent sentence. So We have two senses for those two proper names. Clark Kent is the mild-mannered reporter for the Daily Planet, and Superman is the Man of Steel, and they're very different in their senses. And then at some point Lois Lane figures out that even though these terms have different senses, they actually have the same reference. They refer to the same entity in the world. So I think Frege's distinction here is very useful because it helps explain sentences like that, like Clark Kent is Superman. So even though they have different senses, they have the same reference. Or take a sentence like, there is no Santa Claus. And if you analyze it from this point of view, you say what that means is that even though Santa Claus has a sense, this guy who lives in the North Pole and delivers presents to children on Christmas, nonetheless he has no reference. There is no actual entity in the world that Santa Claus refers to. So having both sense and reference is really useful for your theory of meaning there. All right, so let's move on from these philosophical distinctions like sense and reference, and look at some of the ideas from psychology. And one thing that psychologists like to point out is that common nouns in particular seem to correspond to categories in the human mind. So these words like mountain and apple and tree and so on, those really denote categories, and objects can be a member of that category. An individual object is an apple, and there are many apples. And when we see an object, we kind of put it into these categories. We say, oh, that's an apple and that's a pear. And these distinctions are based on perceptual cues, texture, size, color, function, these kinds of things. And these categories, furthermore, are not they're organized. They're not just floating around by themselves. They form these kinds of taxonomies. I put an example of a taxonomy here on the screen, just a very simple toy taxonomy here, but it shows fish and bird and so on, and these hypernyms and hyponyms, the entities that are above and below in generality. So a shark is a kind of fish, and a fish is a kind of animal, and a bird is a kind of animal, and so on. And these have different properties. And it kind of makes sense that humans would organize their categories this way, right? Because it supports inference. That's the whole point of this. We've evolved to, make these kinds of inferences. Like, oh, if this is a kind of fish, then that means I can eat it, and it swims, and it has all these properties that fish have. So it's very useful to have these kind of inferential properties associated with our categories. Let's see, here's another example from WordNet, this big thesaurus you can download from the linguistics department at Princeton University. This shows just a small fraction of their big taxonomy that they constructed, including natural versus artificial objects and things like that. I'm going to cite here some work by a psychologist named Eleanor Roche, who's done a lot of work on semantics of words and these ideas about categories. She points out that within a taxonomy there's a particular layer of that taxonomy. In other words, a particular level that seems to be kind of optimal, and optimal in a couple senses. One is that this is the level that children learn. So if you look at the objects that I've pictured here on the slide, if you ask a child, or an adult for that matter, to identify those objects, they would say, well, that's a rabbit, a car, and a chair. And that's exactly the level of generality that she's talking about. So we don't get more specific or more general, right? We wouldn't just refer to it as a vehicle or furniture or mammal, because those just aren't as useful. And when children are learning language, they seem to be hardwired to kind of go for this basic level category of rabbit, car, and so on. Her idea was that this is kind of useful because this is the level at which you can maximize your inferences. So if I tell you something is a rabbit, you really that's the best kind of information you can have for making decisions about that. If I told you it was a mammal, that's just too vague. That's not enough information for you. Another contribution of Eleanor Roche was what's called prototype theory. And this was her observation that the entities that make up these categories are not at an equal level. Some are better than others. In other words, some entities are better birds than others. They are more bird-like. And furniture, not all furniture is created equal, right? Some types of furniture are better examples, like chair and sofa. Those are excellent examples of furniture. And then other things, are maybe sort of like furniture, but not quite. Like I don't know, like you have a monitor stand or something. Is that furniture? Not really. Not in the sense that a chair is. And same with birds. If I ask you to think about a bird, you'd probably think about a robin or a jay or a dove or one of these birds that, the so-called passerines that perch and sing and feed worms to their young and things like that. And you're probably less likely to think about a penguin or an ostrich, which are technically birds, but they're not very good birds, are they? They're not prototypical birds. They don't, penguins can't fly in the air like most birds can, and so on. So this is the idea that some exemplars are better than others in these different categories. She was building on philosophical work by Wittgenstein, this guy, and he pointed out the same thing about how some categories, like he had the example of a game, are pretty fuzzy. It's hard to pin down a really good definition of what a game is. But there are other kinds of situations where we do have very hard and fast rules for what counts as a bird or what counts as a game and so on. So this is, I put it on this slide here as the two kinds of mental categories that we use. So the first one is rule-based categories. And sometimes when we use a word, we have a very strict definition in mind. And in certain contexts, like say a legal context or mathematics, when we're doing mathematics, we can't be kind of vague and fuzzy. We have to be exact. So these mathematical notions like an odd number or a prime number, they have very specific definitions. And every number is going to either be prime or not, or odd or even, and so on. And and sometimes in a legalistic setting, we'll have strict definitions of what counts as, say, a grandmother. When in a legal situation, when a grandmother is trying to get custody of her grandchild, the court may want her to prove that she's a grandmother, which means that she's the mother of the parent of the child or something. And then for most situations, we kind of get by with fuzzy categories. This is what Eleanor Roche was talking about. These prototype categories of bird and tool and furniture and so on. Vegetable, usually we just kind of think of a vegetable as something we throw in a salad, and we don't really use a strict rule-based definition like a botanist would use or something like that. And both of these kinds of ways of thinking about meaning are useful. It just depends on the situation. There's a fuzzy notion of a grandmother, which is a kindly woman who has gray hair and bakes cookies for you or something like that. And then there's in some situations we think of a grandmother in a more rule-based context where you have to prove that it's the mother of the parent of the child and so on. So another issue that comes up in Chapter 7, they spend a lot of time in Chapter 7 talking about relations between words. And 4 in particular they talk about we already mentioned hypernyms and hyponyms. These are terms that are more or less general than other terms in a taxonomy. And others that you've, I'm sure, heard of are lexical relations are synonyms and antonyms. Here I put an example of some synonyms from WordNet, this thesaurus that I mentioned that comes from Princeton, and they essentially list the senses of each term in their database by linking it to other words that have similar senses. And you can see some of those links here. The words themselves are in red, and then the links between them show some of the similar senses. So these are words that are, at least in part, synonymous with each other. There's a question about whether any two words are truly synonymous in English or any other language. But you might say that, you can think of a continuum of synonymy. Words are kind of more or less synonymous. They have shared meaning, let's say. I won't mention antonyms, but you should read some of the discussion of antonyms in chapter 7, the different kinds of antonyms they talk about, complementary, and what were the other terms? Converse was another term. I put some questions on the problem set about those kinds of antonyms. Gradable was another one. So some of these adjectives like tall and short we think of as antonyms, but they're gradable because just because you're not tall doesn't mean you're not short. You might be sort of somewhere in between. Whereas other types of antonyms are complementary. If you're not male, then you have to be female, and if you're not dead, then you have to be alive, and so on. And I'll let you read about that in chapter 7. So another final topic to look at here is this notion of deixis. This is very important. This will come up later in the course when we talk about child language acquisition. This is a special kind of meaning. It's a kind of reference. Remember, reference was meaning that associates a word with some entity in the world, and deixis is a kind of reference. It's called deixis by linguists, and it's called indexicals by philosophers. But these are words that are interpreted in context. They include pronouns, these personal pronouns like I and you and he and it and so on. And notice the meaning of those pronouns is not fixed, right? It depends who's making the utterance. So when I say I, it's very different from when you say I. And when I say it depends on the situation, what it refers to. And so words that behave this way are called deictic terms or indexicals. This comes from the Greek word for index, like your index finger for pointing. These are words that point, in other words, and they can point to different things in different contexts. Every language in the world seems to have these kinds of deictic forms, that is, forms that don't have an absolute reference but a changeable reference that depends on the context. And people have studied, what they call deictic systems in different languages. English and Spanish, for example, tend to be very me-centered. We have words like deictic terms like here and there in English and Spanish, and it really refers to me, the speaker. When something is near me, I say it's here, and when something is away from me, then I say it's there. In other languages, like I gave examples here from Fijian, they take the speaker into account. They have different deictic terms for near you. So there might be a there that means there by you, and then there's yet another there that means there away from both of us, for example. So that's an example of a deictic system in these different languages. All right, well let's review some of these ideas that we looked at then. So first was this notion of reference. The reference was this direct relation between a word and some entity in the world, and we saw this is a pretty good theory of meaning, at least when it's restricted to proper names like Microsoft and Barack Obama. So we say that the word Barack Obama refers to the actual entity in the world. Pronouns are like this as well. Pronouns refer to entities in the world. But that's not enough to have a a theory of reference, you also have to have a theory of sense. So you need two kinds of meaning. And words like, tradition and alive and near, human, these may or may not have a reference, but they certainly also have a sense. That is sort of a cognitive content to them that can be captured in these dictionary definitions. And what Frege pointed out is that we need both kinds of meaning. We need to talk about sense and reference as two distinct and equally important kinds of meaning. And then we looked at these categories. We saw that common nouns like chair and dog and tree, they correspond to these categories. And we saw some of the ideas about categories, how you have hypernyms and hyponyms, and prototypical categories. They're kind of, membership in a category is kind of fuzzy, right? Tomato is kind of a vegetable in some sense. I don't know, a botanist might argue that it's really a fruit or something, and so some of these membership in these categories can be a little problematic sometimes. And we saw that certain exemplars are better. A robin is kind of in a sense, a better example of a bird, is more prototypical bird than, say, an ostrich or a penguin. And then finally we looked at these deictic terms. So this is a special small class of words, personal pronouns like I and me and you and him, and other expressions like here and there, now, yesterday, tomorrow. And notice that their meaning is not fixed. It changes every time you use it. So the word tomorrow changes meaning depending on the day that it's used and so on. And this is an important distinction that'll come up later in some future problem sets. These deictic terms. Well, that should be enough to get you going on your problem set there on the semantics of words. And we'll get together on Monday, March 31st, and we'll look at semantics of larger units. We'll move up to phrases and sentences and look at some of the studies from philosophers and psychologists about meaning that's associated with propositions and sentences and larger units of meaning. All right, hope you had a great spring break, and I will see you Monday morning.